The funny thing about people laughing at you is that sometimes they're standing exactly where the flood is going to hit first. 3 months before my neighbor's basements filled with river water, they were sitting in folding chairs at the HOA meeting, sipping lemonade and joking about the castle wall I'd built around my yard. They said it looked paranoid. They said it looked ridiculous. One guy actually asked if I was preparing for a medieval siege. And I remember sitting there thinking, you all really have no idea how water works. My name's Daniel Harper. I'm 42 years old, a civil engineer by trade, and for the last 11 years I've lived in a little riverside neighborhood outside a town called Cedar Hollow, Kentucky. Not the kind of place you'd find on a postcard, but quiet, tree-lined, decent people mostly, the kind of subdivision where kids ride bikes in circles and someone's always grilling burgers on a Sunday afternoon. 15 houses total. One road in, one road out. And a slow brown river curling behind the tree line like it's been there since before any of us had mortgages. Now here's the thing about our neighborhood that most people don't notice until they pull up a topographic map. The whole place slopes downward toward the river, except for one awkward dip right in the middle where my house sits. Not dramatically lower, just enough. About 7 feet below the properties behind me. Which means when it rains hard, gravity starts making decisions. I bought that house back in 2013, before the neighborhood even had an HOA. Back then it was just a handful of homes, a developer trying to sell the dream of riverfront living, and a lot of empty lots. My property was one of the older builds. Small brick ranch. Nothing fancy, but solid. And when I signed the papers, the county surveyor pointed something out that stuck in my head. He tapped the map and said, "Water's gonna want to run right through here if we ever get a real storm." I asked him what real storm meant. He just shrugged. 5 inches in an afternoon. I laughed at the time. Kentucky weather felt predictable back then. But when you spend your career studying drainage systems and runoff models, little details start sticking with you, like puzzle pieces you don't realize you're collecting. Fast forward 10 years. By then, Cedar Hollow estates looked different. Big houses had gone up on the ridge behind mine, the kind with stone columns, 3-car garages, and outdoor kitchens people use twice a year. The Homeowners Association formed around 2016, and eventually the president of that HOA became a man named Victor Langley. Victor was 65, retired from some kind of medical equipment company, always wearing pressed polo shirts and boat shoes like he'd just stepped off a yacht, even though the closest thing we had to an ocean was the muddy Ohio River 40 miles away. His house sat directly uphill from mine. 2 stories, massive glass patio doors, landscaped yard that looked like a golf course brochure. Victor liked things orderly. Symmetrical hedges. Perfect lawns. Rules. Lots of rules. You couldn't paint your mailbox without approval. You couldn't leave a trailer parked longer than 48 hours. And apparently, you couldn't build anything that offended Victor's sense of neighborhood aesthetics. Which brings us to last spring. March had been wet. Really wet. The kind of steady rain that doesn't feel dramatic but keeps the soil soaked like a sponge. I'd been watching the forecasts, watching the river levels, watching the soil saturation charts the way some people watch football stats. And one afternoon after work, I stood in my backyard during a storm and saw exactly what I'd been worried about. Water was pouring downhill between the houses behind me. Not trickling, pouring. A sheet of muddy runoff spreading across my lawn toward the foundation of my house. Now, if you're not an engineer, you might look at that and think, well, that's just rain. But I could see the pattern. Every yard uphill had been landscaped over the years. Patios, retaining walls, new driveways, drainage pipes redirected who knows where. None of it coordinated. None of it engineered as one system. It was like 15 people slowly rearranging the plumbing of a bathtub. Eventually, something's gonna overflow. So I started doing what engineers do. I pulled county watershed maps, elevation surveys, rainfall probability charts, and after 2 weeks of running numbers, the conclusion was painfully simple. If we ever got a serious flash storm, the runoff from 6 uphill properties would funnel directly toward my house. First my foundation, then my basement, and after that, it would start climbing back uphill toward the houses that created the problem in the first place. Water doesn't care about property lines. It just follows gravity. So I made a decision. I hired a contractor friend of mine from Louisville, and we built what the HOA would later call my fortress. Technically, it was just a reinforced concrete flood barrier. 3 sides of my property, about 4 feet high. steel rebar grid inside the concrete, and 6 controlled drainage gates installed along the base. Heavy steel panels I could manually open or close depending on how the runoff needed to be directed. When the gates were open, water from uphill could pass through my yard into a natural drainage channel near the river. When they were closed, the barrier protected my foundation and forced runoff to follow the original hillside slope instead. It cost me $53,000, most of my savings. But it solved the problem. Or at least, it solved my problem. I finished construction in early April. 2 weeks later, the HOA meeting happened. And that's when Victor Langley saw the wall. I can still picture the room. The little community clubhouse with cheap carpet and those fluorescent lights that hum like tired bees. Victor stood up at the front holding a printed photo of my backyard like it was evidence in a trial. "Daniel," he said, voice smooth but tight, "would you care to explain why you've constructed what appears to be a defensive perimeter around your property?" A few people chuckled. I leaned back in my chair. "It's a flood barrier." More laughter. Victor smiled thinly. "Well, it's an eyesore." Someone behind him muttered, "Looks like the Berlin Wall." And that's when I realized something important. They thought this was a joke. Victor folded his arms. "You'll need to remove that structure," he said casually, "or the association will begin issuing daily fines." I tilted my head. "Under what covenant?" He blinked. "Excuse me. My property deed predates the HOA bylaws by 14 years, I said, still calm, still sitting there like we were discussing lawn fertilizer, which means those restrictions don't apply retroactively. The room got quieter. Victor's smile tightened. "Well, we'll see about that." And the meeting moved on. But the look he gave me before sitting down, that quiet, irritated look of a man used to getting his way. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about landscaping anymore. It had become personal, and neither of us yet understood just how expensive that was about to become. The strange thing about neighborhood politics is that it rarely starts with anything big. It starts with little looks, little comments, the kind that sound polite, but carry just enough edge to let you know you've crossed some invisible line. After that HOA meeting, Victor Langley didn't come knocking on my door or anything dramatic like that. No shouting matches, no threats in the street. Instead, it was quieter. And honestly, that made it worse. A week after the meeting, I got the first letter. Plain white envelope. HOA letterhead. Inside was a formal notice of noncompliance. According to Victor and the board, my flood wall violated the visual harmony guidelines of Cedar Hollow Estates. Visual harmony. I remember sitting at my kitchen table reading that phrase 3 times, just kind of blinking at the paper like maybe it would start making sense. Because the funny thing about that phrase is it doesn't exist anywhere in my property agreement. Not legally. Not enforceably. My deed was recorded 14 years before the HOA even existed, which means their rules apply to houses built after the association formed, but not to mine. I called a lawyer friend in Lexington just to be sure. He laughed when I explained the situation. "You're fine," he said. "They can complain all they want, but unless that wall crosses your property line, they've got nothing." So I filed the letter away, went back to work, and for a while, that seemed like the end of it. But Victor wasn't the kind of man who enjoyed losing quietly. Over the next few weeks, little things started happening. Nothing illegal, just pressure. A couple neighbors stopped waving when I walked my dog. One afternoon, I overheard someone at the mailbox cluster say, "Guy thinks he's smarter than everybody else." And then one evening in May, Victor himself walked down my driveway. He had that same neat polo shirt, same confident posture, hands clasped behind his back like he was inspecting a golf course. He stopped about 10 feet from the wall, looked at it, then looked at me. "You planning on keeping this thing?" he asked. His voice was calm, but there was irritation sitting just under the surface. "Yeah," I said. He nodded slowly. "You realize it's redirecting water?" "Correct. To other properties." I shrugged. "Technically, it restores the original watershed path." Victor frowned. "You engineers love that word." "What word?" "Technically." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Just wind in the trees, a lawn mower somewhere down the street. Finally, he said, "You're making this neighborhood look ridiculous." I leaned on the railing of my porch. "Victor, do you know what happens during a 5-inch storm event?" He smiled thinly. "Daniel, it rains every year." "Not like that." He waved his hand dismissively. "You're overthinking this." And there it was. That sentence. Overthinking. Engineers hear that one a lot. usually from people who have never had to explain to a city council why a bridge collapsed. Victor turned and started walking back up the driveway. Then he paused. "Just so you know," he said without looking back, "the board is discussing daily fines." "How much?" $500 per day. Now, if you do the math, that's $15,000 a month, which meant this wasn't about aesthetics anymore. This was about pressure. But here's the thing Victor didn't understand. I wasn't bluffing when I built that wall. I had run the numbers. All of them. 2 days later, I went down to the county planning office and pulled the official watershed survey for the entire Cedar Hollow hillside. Then I compared it with the modern property layouts. Driveways, patios, retaining walls, everything. And what the model showed was, honestly, kind of fascinating. If my flood barrier didn't exist, storm runoff would flow downhill in a wide sheet, spreading across multiple properties before draining toward the river. But with modern landscaping, things had changed. A lot. Stone patios had become channels. Decorative retaining walls had become barriers. Driveways had become little concrete rivers. All of that redirected water. And the lowest point in the entire chain was Victor Langley's basement. From there it would spill toward 3 other homes. I stared at that map for a long time. Not because I wanted revenge. Honestly, I just wanted confirmation. And the confirmation came with a simple realization. My wall wasn't hurting anyone. In fact, with the drainage gates open, it was quietly protecting half the neighborhood. The water passed through my yard into the old drainage ditch that developers had ignored back in 2007. Without that path, the hillside turned into a bathtub, which meant Victor had been yelling at the one person who was accidentally saving his house. I considered explaining that. Really. But every interaction we'd had made it pretty clear he wasn't interested in learning. Victor liked authority, not diagrams. So I did something instead. I called my insurance agent, upgraded my policy. Then I had my lawyer draft a document clarifying my drainage system was entirely on private property and operated at my discretion. Just paperwork, quiet preparation. Because if there's one thing engineers learn early, it's that nature doesn't negotiate. And right around that time, the weather forecast started changing. Late May, the National Weather Service issued a heavy rainfall outlook for our region. 3 to 5 inches possible in under 2 hours. Flash flood conditions. Most people don't think much about those alerts. They hear rainstorm and imagine puddles. But 5 inches in 2 hours. That's not rain. That's physics. On Friday afternoon, the sky turned the color of old steel. You could feel the pressure change in the air, that weird heaviness that settles over everything before a serious storm. Around 5:30, I walked outside. The wind had picked up, leaves flipping over, distant thunder rolling across the valley. And standing there in the quiet, looking at that concrete wall running along my yard, I realized something that made me stop breathing for a second. I had a choice. Because the drainage gates were still open, which meant the runoff from uphill would pass through my property like it always had. My yard would flood first. My basement would take the initial pressure. And eventually, the water would drain toward the river. But if I closed the gates, the barrier would force water to follow the original hillside slope, straight back toward the houses that had redirected it for years. Now, before anyone jumps to conclusions, let me say this clearly. Closing those gates wasn't illegal. It didn't break any agreements. It simply meant my system stopped functioning as a neighborhood drainage shortcut. Water would behave the way it did before the developers flattened half the hill. Nature's default setting. I stood there for a long time thinking about it. About Victor. About those HOA letters. About the way people had laughed in that meeting room. Finally, thunder cracked somewhere close enough to rattle the windows. And the first drops started hitting the pavement. Big ones. Heavy. The kind that leave dark circles on concrete. I walked over to the control box mounted near the corner of the wall. Unlocked it. Inside were the steel levers connected to each drainage gate. 6 of them. 1 for each channel that cut through the barrier. The wind pushed colder air down the street as the storm rolled in. Rain began falling harder. And standing there in the gathering downpour, I made a decision that felt strangely calm. Not angry. Not vindictive. Just logical. I grabbed the first lever. Pulled it down. The steel gate slid into place with a deep metallic thud. Then the second. Then the third. By the time I closed the 6th gate, the rain was coming down in sheets. Water was already racing along the gutters uphill, following gravity, looking for somewhere to go. I locked the control box. walked back to my porch, and watched the storm arrive. What happened over the next 50 minutes changed my relationship with every neighbor on that hill, but not in the way anyone expected. By 6 o'clock, the rain had turned serious. Not the gentle kind that taps on your windows and makes you want coffee. This was the loud, hammering kind, the kind that fills the gutters in minutes and makes the whole sky look like it's pouring a lake down onto the ground. I stood on my porch with my arms crossed, watching the street slowly darken with water. The first thing you notice during a real storm isn't flooding. It's movement. Water starts running everywhere. Down sidewalks, across driveways, between fences. Little streams forming in places you've never seen them before. And because I had spent weeks staring at those watershed maps, I could see exactly what was happening. The runoff was coming down the hill behind Victor's house first. Then it split along the stone retaining walls his landscaper had installed 2 summers ago. Half of it shot across Patricia Dunn's yard 2 houses over. The rest poured toward Victor's patio doors. By 6:18, the street drains were already struggling. You could hear them gurgling. That hollow sucking sound when pipes are trying to swallow more water than they were ever designed for. I went inside, made myself a cup of coffee, and sat down near the back window. Not because I was enjoying any of this, but because watching storms is something engineers do. You learn from them. You see where the system fails. Outside, the rain kept intensifying. By 6:30, the hillside had turned into exactly what the model predicted, a giant sloping sheet of runoff. And without the drainage gates open in my wall, all that water was staying uphill. At 6:37, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I let it ring. 30 seconds later, it rang again. This time it was Patricia. "Daniel," she said breathlessly the moment I answered. "Is your yard flooding?" "No," I said. There was a pause. "Well, ours is." I could hear water slapping against something in the background. Maybe a deck. Maybe a door. "Have you checked your basement pump?" I asked. "Yes, it's running, but..." Thunder cracked so loud it drowned out the rest of her sentence. "I've got to go," she said quickly. The line went dead. I walked back to the window. The rain kept falling. And then, around 6:43, something happened exactly when the model said it would. Victor's backyard lights flicked on. Through the rain, I could see him out there on the patio. White polo shirt already soaked. He was staring at the rising water pooling along the base of his house. Even from my yard, I could hear the whine of his sump pump kicking on. Then off. Then on again. Working overtime. At 6:49, my phone rang again. "Victor." I answered. "Daniel," he said sharply, skipping any kind of greeting. "Your wall is blocking runoff." I leaned back in my chair. "It's protecting my property. You need to open those gates." "Why?" "Because water is backing up here." I glanced out the window again. The rain hadn't slowed at all. "How much water?" I asked calmly. "You know exactly how much water." I didn't respond. For a moment, the only sound on the phone was rain pounding against whatever roof Victor was standing under. Then his voice came back, tighter this time. "You're creating a hazard." "No," I said quietly. "I'm letting the watershed behave naturally." Silence. Then he snapped. "This is not the time for a lecture." I sighed. "Victor, 3 months ago, I tried explaining runoff flow patterns to you. You built a wall without approval. I built protection on my property. You're flooding the neighborhood." "No," I said again, "gravity is." He hung up. Outside, the storm kept roaring. By 6:54, the thing I had hoped wouldn't happen happened. Through the sheets of rain, I saw Victor and another man wrestling with something near his basement door. Then suddenly a wave of muddy water surged across the patio. The door gave way, and even from across the yards I could see water rushing inside. That was the moment the situation changed from inconvenience to disaster. Over the next 20 minutes, my phone turned into a siren. Calls, texts, voicemails. Michael Carter from the corner house. Patricia again. Someone from the HOA board. Everyone asking the same question. Can you open the wall? But storms don't stop just because people start negotiating. By the time the rain finally slowed around 7:40, the damage was done. Water had pushed into 4 basements uphill. Victor's the worst. When the clouds finally broke, the entire street looked like someone had dumped a lake across it. Mud everywhere. Branches. Debris. And a kind of stunned quiet hanging over the neighborhood. I slept fine that night. Not because I felt good about what happened, but because I knew I hadn't done anything wrong. The next morning there was a knock on my door. Hard. Sharp. I opened it. Victor Langley stood there looking 10 years older. His boat shoes were soaked. Mud splattered halfway up his khakis. Behind him in the street, I could see restoration trucks already parked in front of 2 houses. Industrial fans. Dehumidifiers. The smell of wet drywall drifting through the morning air. Victor held a folder in his hand. "You need to open the gates," he said. "Not angry now. Just tired." I nodded slowly. "I can." He blinked. "Then do it." I leaned against the doorframe. "Before I do, you should read something." I stepped inside and came back with my own folder. Inside were the watershed diagrams, the runoff models, engineering reports. Victor flipped through them quickly. His eyes slowed as the diagrams started making sense. Arrows showing water flow, elevation lines, pressure points, 6 uphill houses highlighted, including his. "What is this?" he asked quietly. "A drainage analysis." He kept reading. "And your wall prevents all that runoff from hitting your basement." Victor looked up at me. For the first time since I'd met him, he seemed unsure. "You're saying that wall protects us?" "When the gates are open," I said. He stared at the papers. "You never explained this." I tried. He closed the folder slowly. The street behind him buzzed with generators and shop vacs. "How much?" he asked. I didn't pretend not to understand. 12,000 a year. His eyebrows jumped. "For what?" "For operating and maintaining a private drainage system that protects 6 properties uphill." "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" I nodded toward the restoration truck parked at his house. "I'm guessing your basement renovation cost more than that." Victor looked back down the street. Workers were hauling soggy carpet out of Patricia's garage. After a long moment, he said, "You're serious?" "Very. And if we don't pay?" I shrugged. "Then I keep the gates closed during major storms." He stared at me for several seconds. Then he laughed. A short, exhausted laugh. "You planned this?" "No," I said calmly. "I prepared." For 3 days, the neighborhood argued. Emergency HOA meetings. Lawyers. Insurance adjusters. A lot of angry conversations. But at the end of the week, something interesting happened. People started doing the math. Repair bills. Flood mitigation. Future risk. Suddenly, $12,000 a year didn't sound so outrageous. The following Thursday, the HOA board came to my house together. Victor, Patricia, Michael, and 2 others. Victor held a document. 10-year agreement. Prepaid annually. $12,000. In exchange, I would operate the drainage gates during major storms and approve any landscaping changes that affected runoff within 200 feet of my property. Victor signed first. The others followed. A week later, we had another HOA meeting. Same little clubhouse. Same buzzing lights. Victor stood at the front of the room again. But this time he cleared his throat and said something very different. "I owe Daniel Harper an apology." The room stayed quiet. I misunderstood the purpose of his flood barrier and the protection it provides for several homes in this neighborhood. He glanced at me briefly, then looked back at the group. "Going forward, the structure will be recognized as part of Cedar Hollow's critical drainage infrastructure." That phrase made me smile a little. Critical infrastructure. 3 months earlier, they had called it ridiculous. The next storm came in August. Not as big, but still heavy. When the rain started, I walked out to the wall, unlocked the control box, and opened the gates. Water flowed through my yard exactly like the model predicted. Down the old drainage channel, toward the river. Not a single basement flooded. These days, Victor waves when he sees me. Not warmly, but respectfully, which is funny when you think about it. Because nothing about the neighborhood really changed. Same houses, same hill, same gravity. The only difference is now, people understand what the wall actually does. Still, every once in a while, someone visiting the neighborhood will look at that concrete barrier running along my yard and ask the same question Victor asked the first day. Why would anyone build something like that? And I usually just smile. Because the real answer isn't about engineering. It's about preparation. Sometimes people call you paranoid for preparing, right up until the moment they realize you were the only one paying attention. And I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, would you have closed the gates that night? Or would you have protected the neighbors who spent months trying to punish you? Let me know in the comments. Because around here, opinions on that storm are still pretty divided.